I was solo camping on a trail just an hour north of Fairbanks, Alaska, near the White Mountains mountain range. I had been at the spot, set up with my tent and everything, for 2 days already. It was just past noon, and I'd made a campfire early, sitting around it and enjoying a meal, when a man showed up. It startled me, as I hadn't seen anyone, or even really any wildlife, for the whole 2 days that I'd been out there. I also didn't hear him walking up, or even see where he came from, whether it was from the trail or just the wilderness. He looked like your typical camper though, backpack gear and everything, and he seemed kind enough. He simply asked if I knew where the cabin was. Although I'd never been to the cabin he was mentioning, I did know what he was talking about. A lot of trails around here have these public shelters, like really small cabins that you can use temporarily along your hikes. Usually they aren't really maintained well and are just on a first come first served basis. During the 2 days I was at this campsite, I saw a separate thin path going into the forest that I assumed led to one of those shelters. I let the man know that if there was a cabin out here, it was probably down there. He thanked me and walked away. I didn't think much more about it. I was just surprised someone else happened to be out here as well. I tended to the fire and relaxed for the rest of the day. This was the last night I planned to stay here before heading back, so I just wanted to enjoy the scenery and calmness. It was probably 9 or 10 p.m., but around this time of year up in Alaska, the sun doesn't fully set really. It gets dark, but not pitch black like it would in most other places. The sun was at the horizon, casting a shadow over the woods, when out of the trees, I saw someone walking toward me. As they got closer, I saw it was the camper from earlier. I was rightfully confused why he was here, but he explained right away that he couldn't find the shelter. I said maybe there wasn't one, I really didn't know, but the man corrected himself, saying he never found the trail that I was talking about, and was hoping I'd show him to it. I thought it was strange he was gone for so long if he never found the trail. Like, why was he coming back hours later? What was he doing for that whole time, if not staying in the shelter? I initially just tried to explain again where the trail was, but he was kind of set on having me lead the way. He sorta guilt-tripped me, saying he didn't have a tent and was relying on that shelter for the night. I felt bad, and even though I didn't want to and found this whole thing a little bit odd, I decided I'd just take him to the path. It wasn't far anyway. I tossed my bag over my shoulders and started leading him there. Where I was sure I'd seen it was maybe a 10-minute walk through the forest. The whole walk there, the guy was pretty quiet. We both just walked without talking much. It felt like something had changed. 10 minutes later though, I found the trail. It was exactly where I said it was. Like, there was no way he could have missed it. And even weirder, I could actually see the shelter far down toward the end of it. Sure, it was far, and trees were blocking a good portion of it, but there's just no way he didn't find it from the directions I gave him. We walked a little closer, but the man didn't seem satisfied. I was expecting a thank you or something, but instead, he said this wasn't the right cabin. I didn't know what he meant. We kept walking, pretty much going right up to the cabin. It definitely didn't look in good shape, but that's always the risk you take with these sort of public shelters. You really should never rely on them. This one looked worse than most, with broken windows, moldy wood, and just overall like it'd been deserted for years. I realized as I was looking at it, the man had gone quiet. I turned around. He had stopped walking, standing maybe 10 feet from me and holding out a knife. His face was stiff, and his eyes had a dead stare. He told me in a monotone and emotionless voice to go in. I tried to ask what the hell he was doing, but he told me again, without answering, to go inside the cabin. My adrenaline was flowing. I was angry that he'd taken advantage of me being helpful, but also scared shitless, knowing that I was alone with him out here. I decided going into the cabin was probably the worst option in this case. There was still some distance between us, so I dropped my bag and started running. Weirdly, I didn't hear him chase me. I looked back once I got further into the woods, and he was still just standing there, holding the knife and staring at me. After I got further into the forest, I found a good place to hide, then stayed there for a while, probably 30 minutes. I hoped that was enough time for the guy to leave. Then, in the cover of the dark, I quietly moved through the trees and back to where the shelter was. The man was gone, or at least not standing outside of the cabin like he was before. But my bag was gone too. I thought I was being smart by dropping it, so I'd be able to run away faster. But since he didn't chase me, now I felt like maybe it was a bad decision. I had basically everything in that bag. My phone, wallet, keys, literally everything. I quietly left the area and went back toward my campsite. I could feel my heart beating faster as I got closer, just sensing that I wasn't alone still. Then I saw it. The bright glow of a campfire burning right in the middle of my campsite. I thought by now it would have burned out. I walked a little closer, seeing my tent was still up, and from what I could see, the man was nowhere around. It was just the near silent woods with the quiet crackling fire. But then I saw my bag. It was sitting right in the middle of the campsite. Part of me really wanted to run up and grab it, but I also knew this was extremely suspicious. Why'd he bring it back? He must have known I was going to go back to the cabin for my bag, and after not finding it, I'd then go back to the campsite. Even knowing all that, and that this had to be too good to be true, I was still about to run up and snatch it, when all of a sudden, the man appeared. He casually walked out of the darkness behind the campfire, tossing in some more sticks, and then sitting down. I could hear him humming to himself too, like he was relaxed and just waiting. Fuck that. I turned around and found the main trail, and hiked through the dark all the way back to the road. Took me hours to flag down a car who was willing to help me. I then notified police, and they went out to the forest with rangers in the morning, only to find nothing. All my stuff was gone, as if it were never there. Even the stones from the campfire were moved and thrown back into the forest, like they were trying to cover up that it was ever even a campsite. The rangers also informed me that the cabin out there was discontinued, which just meant that no rangers were taking care of it or servicing it anymore. That encounter had me really uneasy for a long time. I couldn't trust anyone. I've gotten better over time, but I can't help myself from thinking about what might have happened if I'd gone into that deserted shelter or had tried to get my bag. I was likely one bad decision away from never leaving those woods. Me and a childhood friend of mine, I'll call him Ethan, were out in the forests of Maine on a short camping trip. We both were fairly experienced. However, this was Ethan's first time going to this spot. I'd been there plenty of times before though, so I knew the area pretty well. We backpacked down a several-hour-long trail to get to a clearing in the trees that we set up camp in. I think we arrived around 6, so after setting everything up, we built up a nice campfire and made food. then cracked open a few beers and talked around the fire as the sun set around us. It was a chill, enjoyable night. I want to say around 2 hours into the night though, we both heard what we thought was something moving around just outside of our campsite, like in the darkness, past what our campfire was lighting up. We looked and saw nothing, and for the rest of the night, we heard nothing else. We thought it was probably just a small animal scurrying away. Honestly, if nothing else happened, I never even would have remembered it or thought about it again. That's how insignificant it seemed in the moment. If you're unfamiliar with camping, it might seem strange, but being out here all the time, those kinds of noises happen a lot and are almost always nothing to worry about. Once we had our couple drinks and started getting tired, we called it a night and poured out the fire, then got in our tents and fell asleep. In the morning, we woke up early, as this spot was good for a reason. That reason is because there was a very secluded, private pond just a half mile through the woods from the campsite. Nobody knew about it, because the trail didn't actually lead to it. It was really nice though, having a mini waterfall and small river running through it. We spent most of our morning there, like a whole 3 or 4 hours. Eventually, we headed back to make food and rest for a bit. I even took a short nap. Again though, around 6 the sun was getting lower, and we hadn't collected any firewood yet for the campfire. Most of the dry sticks lying around the camp we used up last night, so I had to do a little more searching to collect what we needed. Midway through, Ethan said he was going to take a walk around and just explore the other areas, but would pick up whatever he could on his way back. I said sure, and just continued grabbing sticks off the ground. Ethan did this pretty much every time we were out camping. I think he just enjoyed having some time to spend alone and to just take in the nature. Anyway, I got a good amount of firewood and sat back down at the camp, just wasting time until Ethan got back so I could start the fire. The sun got lower and lower, and eventually I just kind of realized it had been a strangely long time since he'd left. Usually he wasn't out this long, and he was experienced enough to know to not be wandering the woods so close to sunset. The only way we had to keep in contact out here, where there's no service, is through our small satellite messengers. We kept them on us at all times in our small waste packs, along with bear spray and other stuff like that. It's usually more of an SOS device, but in situations like this, it came in handy too. I pulled mine out to send him a message, but saw that he'd already sent me one just a few minutes ago. Ethan said he got kinda lost, but happened to stumble back to the pond. I sent a message saying to just stay there and I'll hurry over to lead him back. Being lost, it's always best just to stay put and not risk getting any more lost, and both me and Ethan knew that. So, me knowing the area, I quickly started heading to the pond. At this point, it was really just a race against the sun. Even having headlamps and knowing the area during the day, it would still be really easy to get lost at night. I got about halfway to the pond, maybe 4 or 5 minutes away, when I got another message. I reached into my bag and checked it, assuming it was just going to be him checking in or asking for an ETA. But Ethan sent the words, "I see you." What did he mean, "I see you"? I wasn't even near the pond yet. I stopped and looked around, confused and not seeing him anywhere. I said I wasn't there yet and didn't see him. Slightly worried, I started moving faster, basically running to the pond. I got there quickly, running up to the tree line before the water. Ethan wasn't there. From where I was, I could see the whole tree line around the pond, and he wasn't anywhere around. I felt blood rush from my face and pulled the messenger back out. My last message saying that I didn't see him hadn't been opened. I called out his name, hearing my voice echo through the trees. The sun was nearly gone, and the forest was getting quieter and darker. Maybe he already started heading back, like he somehow remembered the way. I don't know why he would, but where else would he be? With the daylight practically gone, I knew it was safest for me to head back and figure things out from the camp. I didn't start the fire yet, so if I waited too long, I'd never be able to find the campsite in the dark. I began walking, feeling uneasy as I moved through the trees and felt the woods get darker and darker. All I could think about was the ominous last message he sent: "I see you." It was nearly pitch black by the time I was a minute or so from the clearing, but then I saw something. A flickering orange glow right from where the campsite was. As I got closer, I could see that the campfire was lit and someone was standing right by it. I started approaching, feeling a wave of relief, knowing Ethan had made it back safely. But when I got closer, the person suddenly shifted and looked toward me, then sprinted away from the fire and out of the campsite. Heart pumping, I ran up, confused and terrified. That wasn't Ethan. I pulled my messenger back out and started spamming texts. At this point, I was seriously worried and disturbed by what was going on. But just a minute or so later, Ethan came running out of the woods and into the campsite. He had a face of both fear and relief. He immediately said we had to go. I agreed, mentioning the guy I saw by the fire, and him saying it was likely the same guy he saw approaching him by the pond. He said he thought it was me, until he got closer and realized it was someone else. Apparently then, Ethan tried asking if the guy knew how to get back to the trail, but the man didn't respond. He just kept walking forward, revealing a really unsettling smile across his face. And according to Ethan, something about him looked really off, like his face was uncanny. Something just wasn't normal about it. This sent him into a panic, where he just ran in the direction he thought was most likely toward the campsite, getting lost again, but eventually seeing the fire and going toward it. We packed and left. The hike back was unnerving to say the least, but we did manage to get to our car and leave. This event made me rethink back on the whole camping trip, remembering the movement we heard outside of our camp on the first night, and just putting all the pieces together. Likely, the man that was out there was watching us the whole time, waiting for one of us to be alone. Even just thinking about his presence outside of our campsite as we were talking, sleeping, and everything, completely unknown to us, is extremely disturbing. We still talk about that camping trip every now and again, but never plan to go back to those woods. This was in 2016, but I remember every detail of the night as if it had just happened. I go out in the woods just south of the town I live in pretty frequently, at least 4 or 5 times a year. This weekend, I kind of just had that urge to get out and have some time alone, so I quickly filled my backpack and drove down to my favorite trail. I honestly don't know if it was even an actual trail that was marked on maps and all that. Nobody was ever hiking it or camping on it, so I'm really not sure if it was well known. I parked on the side of the road near the trees, got my bag out, and hiked for 2 hours to the end. This part of the woods wasn't mountainous or anything. It was very flat and just densely covered in trees. Great for a chill 1 or 2 day camping trip, but definitely nothing more than that, as it can get kinda boring. The campsite had nothing really to it. There was a few hours until sunset, so I took my time getting everything perfect and starting the campfire. I relaxed and ate some trail mix, just enjoying the warm fire and birds chirping. When the sun got lower, I tossed more sticks in. I always found it interesting how quickly the forest goes from being so alive to almost instantly getting quiet once the sun sets. I sat there and listened to the quietness for only about 25 minutes after dark before a strange sound interrupted the silence. It was music. It was coming from the distance, pretty far away, and it sounded like some old classical song. It almost sounded like an old record player. I stood up and looked in the direction it was coming from. Was there another campsite nearby? Maybe it was a group just casually playing some music, albeit really loudly. I stayed at my campsite and just listened for a while. Had to be 30 minutes at least. But what was so odd, and honestly kinda eerie, was that the song never changed. It was the same classical song on repeat, filling the void of the silent woods. I'm not one to usually care much if other campers are nearby, or having a loud bonfire party, or whatever they're doing, but this felt different. Something was off, and I didn't like it. After those 30 minutes, I decided to walk a bit closer just to see what was going on. I didn't want to creep on anyone, but just wanted to make sure it was nothing weird so I'd be able to sleep tonight. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. I felt like I was walking pretty far, which made it even weirder that I could hear it from so far away. The closer I got, though, and the louder the music got, something started to feel really creepy. I could tell I had goosebumps, and my heart was beating a little faster. It was then that I realized I'd only brought my flashlight. I should have brought my pocket knife or pepper spray, but I didn't even think about it. Eventually, I could tell I was getting really close. The music had to be coming from just 30 or 40 feet away, but I couldn't see anything. No bonfire or campfire or light of any kind. And then I saw it. A giant speaker sitting kind of propped up behind a tree. Nothing else was around it. I shined my flashlight everywhere, and there were no signs of anyone. I walked up to the speaker. It looked like an old one from the early 2000s, basically just a giant box with an old LCD display and worn out buttons to control it. I found the power button and turned it off. Suddenly, the forest was silent. The stark difference was eerie. Who did this? It almost felt like a trap or something, but even then, I made every excuse for it to not be. Like another camper leaving it behind on accident, or I don't know. Nothing really made sense about it, but I really didn't want to think it was the worst. I didn't stay longer than I had to. I hurried back to my campsite, feeling relieved to see my campfire and get back to what felt like the safety of my camp. However, as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that loomed over me, like something was still off, but I didn't know what it was. The feeling got worse and worse until I remembered about my knife and pepper spray, thinking that if I kept them nearby, I'd feel safer. But that's when I realized what was off. Things were missing. My matches for starting fires, my cooking utensils, and both my knife and pepper spray, all just gone. My body tensed up. Someone was here. I didn't even have to think for a second longer before packing what was left. And as I did, I heard it again. The music playing from out in the darkness of the woods. Closer though, definitely not far out where I'd found it before. I hurried, getting out of the campsite and running down to the trail. As I got further and heard the music fading out, I started to feel a little bit better. Still freaked out, but I thought whoever was out there had to be by the speakers where the music was coming from, which meant I was getting further away from them. I got about 15 minutes down the path, now just walking through the quiet forest, far away from any of the music. And that's when I spotted something ahead, laying on the dirt trail. It was my stuff. The knife, pepper spray, utensils, everything that was missing. Someone laid it out perfectly lined up in the middle of the trail. What was the catch? Before I could grab any of it, I heard a flurry of footsteps rushing behind me. I looked back, seeing nothing but darkness, so I just sprinted away, leaving it all behind. I ran for what felt like 10 whole minutes, then continued jogging/fast walking for the rest of the way. Thankfully, I got out of that forest and back to the road. I really can't say what the hell I experienced that night. It feels like somehow I barely managed to escape some psycho, almost like they were playing with their food. I haven't been back to that forest, and I never plan to. This happened to me almost 8 years ago, and I've never stopped thinking about it. I was in my early 20s at the time and was camping out in the wilderness of Upper Idaho. I wouldn't say I was an experienced camper yet, but I did go out pretty frequently on long hikes and knew the basics of camping. Also, in that territory, there was a lot of wildlife, including black bears and grizzly bears, so being prepared was a must, which deterred a lot of casual hikers and campers. Not many people live up there either, and you'd only see the occasional tourist also hiking a trail. Most of the campsites in Upper Idaho are not very crowded. That being said, although admittedly unnecessary, I tried to stay away from those tourist-type spots and stick to lesser-known trails. For this trip, I'd chosen one that was just outside of the big mountain range that was well known. This trail just went through the forest and along the hills bordering the mountain, leading to a nice open spot with views of the mountain range. The nearest trail I knew of was 3 miles away that led to a small lake, which I assumed might have a couple other people, so that's why I skipped it. I was right though. My whole hike there, nobody else was around. The trail seemed basically unused, and when I got to the campground, it was open and empty. I set up my tent on the far side and found some big stones to build a fire pit with. I think I had 2 or 3 hours of daylight left, so I wasn't planning on doing much for the rest of the day. Just sit around the campsite and think about my plans for tomorrow. When the sun set, I built up the fire and roasted some marshmallows while stargazing. The whole valley was really quiet, just a subtle breeze coming through and the occasional wildlife calling out. But then something interrupted the silence. A repeated crunch of leaves coming from out in the woods. After a second, it was pretty obvious that it was a person walking. I didn't know what to do except sit there and stare in that direction, kind of just shocked and confused why someone was out there, until they showed up at the edge of my campsite. It was a man, but with the shadows from the campfire flickering over them, I couldn't make out much to identify them with. I could see they had a typical camping backpack on, and that was about it. They stood there and looked at me, then at the rest of my campsite, and before I could say anything, they said sorry, then turned around and walked back the exact way I heard them come from. Also, the way they said sorry was like they were trying to be quiet. It was just barely louder than a whisper. It was really strange. What were they even sorry for? They had to be looking for a campsite. There's no way they were just walking around at night like that for no reason. It felt really, I guess, unsettling. I didn't feel in danger, but the way they acted was just out of the usual behavior of any hiker I'd ever come across. Their footsteps walked away, turning into the subtle, quiet night it was just moments ago, as if nothing had happened. Despite the unusual interruption, I ended up going back to stargazing and relaxing only a few minutes afterward. I hoped wherever that guy was heading, he'd make it there soon, and safely. but aside from that, I didn't think too much more about it. Several hours went by, or at least it felt like that. Clouds started to roll in, blocking out the moon and stars and casting a shadow over the entire forest. I wasn't exactly tired or ready to sleep yet, so I sat along the campfire and hoped I'd eventually get bored and sleepy enough to call it a night. But then I heard footsteps again. They were more rushed this time, almost like panicked footsteps running through the woods in the exact same place the man came from earlier in the night. I stood up, getting worried as they approached. Then he came into the light. I could tell by the backpack and his general figure that it was the same hiker from before. He walked further up this time, enough for me to see him better. He had a medium scruffy beard and oily black hair, along with some signs of distress on his clothes, as well as dirt scuffed over his face. And his eyes were wide, like he was scared, yet his mouth was straight and emotionless. "Is everything okay? You probably should have made it to your campsite by now. It's pretty late." The man stood there, catching his breath, but keeping on guard. His eyes looked over my right shoulder for a second, then back at me. "Are you lost? Maybe I can help," I said. He then muttered no under his breath, saying he was just hiking out in the woods and didn't mean to bother me. He spoke slowly though, and the whole time his eyes were constantly shifting to something on the right side of me. He'd only look for a split second, then his eyes would lock back onto me. Listen, you look pretty nervous. I can help. Maybe send a radio message for you, or whatever you need." He seemed to ignore what I said, but he then suddenly locked his eyes on me, more intently than before. "You're camping here right now. Why?" The way he asked it was really unsettling. His eyes darted to my right again, and I couldn't resist the urge to look over my shoulder. Empty, dark woods. I saw nothing. I was getting really creeped out now, and wasn't sure how much more I wanted to talk to this guy, let alone try to help him with whatever was going on. Then he asked something even more creepy. "Is it just you here? Are you alone? Where are the others?" Taken aback by the question, I hesitated to respond right away, and before I could even answer, he spoke again. "Have you been following me?" Something was off. His manner was changing and he was tensing up. I said no, and that I didn't know what he was talking about. But then his eyes shifted onto something over my shoulder again. However, this time, they didn't shift back to me. His wide, hollow eyes were locked onto something. He asked one last question. "Then why are you with her?" I instantly turned around and looked over my right shoulder, but my eyes fell on nothing. Still just empty, dark woods. I looked back at the man. His face fell into terror, still staring beyond me, before he suddenly broke out into a sprint, running deeper into the woods. Within seconds, he was past all the lights and completely gone. The direction he ran was nowhere near the trail, or really anything at all. My heart was still racing though. I was looking all around, especially behind me, trying to figure out what the hell that guy was talking about, and what he was seeing. In those brief moments after he asked, "Then why are you with her?" I thought I'd connected everything, that this man was being followed by some woman or group in the woods. And when I looked over my shoulder, I fully expected to see her standing behind me, deranged and terrifying. But now I didn't know what to believe. I was scared shitless though, and was absolutely not staying any longer. I gathered up everything and started moving. Even though I saw the guy run in the other direction from the trail, I was still on edge the entire walk. Every slight noise had me startled and expecting to see some woman following me. or whoever the hell he was talking about. But I never did. I made it to my car and left. The following morning, I decided to put in a note with the police station near me about the guy out there, because with more time to think about it, I was pretty worried about him. While I don't have an exact explanation for what went on that night, I can provide a decent theory for the situation after consulting dozens of people over the years. The most likely and tragic explanation is the man may have gotten lost and been out there for a very long time, probably becoming extremely hungry and dehydrated to the point of near insanity and paranoia, thinking something or someone was following him through the woods at night. Unfortunately, with him not being in the right state of mind, he didn't know help when he saw it. When he found me, he was probably too paranoid to know that I could have saved him, giving him food and water and let him out of the woods. He might have been so out of it that he didn't even know he was lost anymore and was too caught up in the paranoia of whoever he thought was following him. While this is the most probable cause of the man's behavior and what happened that night, there's still no saying if it's actually true. There's a chance he really was being followed and wasn't sure whether or not I was just another stalker part of the group and didn't trust me. If that was the case, then him freaking me out that night likely saved my life from whoever else was out there. However, we probably will never know for sure. The man was never found or spotted since, so unfortunately it seems he never made it out of the woods. It was the middle of summer, and being an avid backpacker and camper, I'd heard from one of my buddies about old fire lookouts that you could rent. Apparently, they were retired lookout stations, usually in the middle of nowhere, miles and miles into the forest. The one I chose was pretty much the most isolated one I could find. It was easier to rent, having available slots basically through the whole summer, and I liked hiking anyway. There was only a single picture I could find of it though, and it was super old and blurry. So really, I had no clue what to expect of the lookout tower. I knew it was built in the 1950s, so it'd be old. But as far as how much restoration was done to it, I was going in blind. I brought my usual backpacking gear and started the hike at 9 a.m. There wasn't much out there as far as views go. Not for the first few hours. It was just very dense, harsh forest terrain. The trail wasn't even much of a trail anymore, just a very rough path. After 5 hours though, I finally got a glimpse of the lookout tower. It was far in the distance still, sitting atop a mountain. It looked very small and wasn't one that was high up on stilts. It looked more like a cabin than anything. Maybe raised up 10 to 15 feet. There was another hour of trekking before I actually got there. The hike was definitely worth it just for the view alone. Felt like I could see the whole world from there. The fire lookout was in rough shape, however. Very noticeably old, with some patchwork here and there done to certain parts. It had a wraparound staircase of 20 or so steps leading up to the walkway that went around the whole lookout, and the inside was entirely empty. It wasn't glamorous, but honestly, it could have been worse, and to have this view, I'd take it any day. With a few hours of sunlight left, I tossed my bag down, made some food, and relaxed on the outer ledge. It was real quiet up there. Just the sound of birds and wind. I was pretty beat from the hike up, so after the sun fell past the horizon, I threw my sleeping stuff on the wooden floorboards and laid down. It was only around 8, so even though I was exhausted, I couldn't quite fall asleep as fast as I wanted. I think 30 to 40 minutes went by. Then I thought I heard something outside the lookout tower. Before I could even get up and look, there were clear footsteps coming up the stairs. I hurried out of my sleeping bag and up to the door, which notably had no locks on it. Few seconds later, a man came around the corner. He was older, say late 40s, and had longish blonde hair. Somehow, he wasn't startled when he saw me, almost like he knew I was already up here.
Great place to stay a few nights, isn't it?
He said, grinning and walking up closer to me. I agreed, still a little nervous, and mentioned I booked it for the next 3 nights. I was already a little put off though, because I knew there was nothing else around here. So him being here, while I was also here, was really strange. I asked if he was camping around here.
Actually, I was hoping to be staying here tonight,
he said, again with a grin. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, but I ended up just saying sorry.
Well, it looks like you've got enough room in there. I mean, it's just you here, right?
After hesitating for a second, I lied, saying a friend of mine was just a few minutes out, and that unfortunately we couldn't let him stay here with us. He looked at me, grin fading from his face, and didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded and started to leave. It wasn't until he turned around to head back down the stairs that I noticed he didn't have a backpack. No gear at all. Surely he had to have left his pack somewhere nearby. Couldn't see why anyone would be this far isolated without any camping gear, even if they were planning on using the fire lookout as a shelter. I got some uneasy feelings about that man, so I stayed up a bit longer and just stared at the forest below the lookouts. I did end up getting really sleepy though, and got back in my sleeping bag and passed out. I woke up in the morning, feeling better and spending the first hour making coffee and enjoying the view. When I headed down from the lookout though, there was a note attached to the wooden railing at the bottom. It was just a piece of paper with the word sorry written on it, with a smiley face next to it. I assumed it had to be from the guy, but if he put this here, then he must have come back sometime in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. I immediately felt really unsettled just thinking about it. The fact he even left a note was just weird. Despite the strange occurrence, I decided to go for a walk. Maybe it was to also scan the area for any signs of the man still being around, because clearly he didn't leave when he should have. I wandered around the forest, down the hill from the fire lookout. There wasn't much to see though. It was all the same dense forest that I'd hiked up through the previous day, and I didn't notice any campsites or things left behind. I went back to the lookout and enjoyed the peace and quiet for the rest of the day. I stayed up much later than I did the night before. I had this small battery-powered lantern that I hung up on the wall so I could see a little better, and I just sort of existed. I thought about whatever and stared out at the darkness beyond the lookout, only slightly being able to make out the outline of the mountains. I want to say I didn't start getting ready for bed until nearly midnight. Could have even been 1 a.m. I set up my stuff, then grabbed my lantern and headed down the steps to the forest to take a leak real quick before bed. I walked up just to the edge of the tree line, but as I got there, I saw something move in front of me. Just a glimpse of something shift out of the dim light from my lantern. I froze for a second, then held it up further forward, although it didn't help much.
Someone there.
The silence that followed my voice made things even more eerie. I basically ran back to the lookout. It didn't feel much safer in there, though. Windows covered every inch of the walls, and like I mentioned before, the door didn't even have a lock on it. Part of me really wanted to leave, But heading out now while it was pitch black out, and with the trail being nearly non-existent, would probably be worse than just staying put. I kept the lantern hung up on the wall and looked out the windows at the forest below. It was really eerie knowing that with the light, if someone was out there, they could probably clearly see me in the window. Meanwhile, all I saw was darkness. I could see the bottom of the stairs though, so that's what I was focusing on, making sure nobody tried to come up. The longer I stayed there watching, the more this sense of unease started to fill my body. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I decided to pack up my stuff. At least then I could make a run for it if I had to. As I stuffed my backpack, I would stop every 30 seconds and go back up to the window to look out at the stairs, then continue packing, repeating this over and over until I finally got everything in my bag and ready to go. I set it up against the wall, then went back to the window. There was a man at the bottom of the stairs. He was standing right at the first step, staring at it, like he was just waiting there. I could only see part of him through all the railings, but I was sure it was the same man from yesterday. He had no backpack on and looked about the same height. I was beyond terrified. Why was he back? And why was he just standing there motionless at the bottom of the steps? What if he decided to come up again? Everything was making my mind race. I must have been at the window watching him for 2 whole minutes before the man finally moved. He took a couple steps back, pausing for a moment, then walked off. The way he went, though, was blocked off for me by the walkway, so I lost sight of him. And if he did keep walking in that direction toward the forest, it was too dark for me to tell. In the moment, I felt sure the man was stalking me, or at least keeping watch of me, and creeping up too close for comfort, especially in the middle of the night. It could have just been my gut telling me something, but I felt like if I stayed any longer, something really bad would happen. I waited a few minutes, then I grabbed my bag and quietly walked down the steps and to the surface below the lookout tower. I can't even describe how unnerved I was walking away from the tower and into the dark forest, knowing there was a chance the guy was still watching me, and possibly following me into the trees. For that very reason, I kept my pocket knife open and in my hand the entire time. I walked for about 15 minutes, which was when the trail started to get a lot less defined, so I was forced to pull out my lantern. I hoped I was far enough that the man didn't follow and wouldn't be able to see the lights. The next 5 hours were exhaustingly unsettling. By then, the sun had come up though, and I was able to finish the hike and leave the forest. I think it's hard to fully put into perspective how horrifying those nights were. Something in me knew there was something bad about that man and his intentions. One thing I keep thinking back on is that I had told the man I booked the tower for 3 nights, which leaves no reason for him to have come back multiple times to check if I was there. It also means he likely thought I'd be there for the 3rd night, so had I not left early and actually stayed for the 3rd night, things might have taken a much more disturbing turn. It was mid-2018. I was 23 and had driven down to Vermont to see my family and hang out for a few weeks. While there, I also wanted to go camping since my parents' house was just outside of the Appalachian Mountains. When I used to live with them still, I'd go out all the time, but since I moved out, I hadn't had the chance to go out camping or even hiking at all. There was one place specifically that I'd had on my mind for a while. Just before I moved, I found a trail on a forum for people exploring abandoned structures, and I'd been wanting to check it out ever since. This trail supposedly led to an old lodge just right in the middle of the forest. So, on a Monday morning, I drove out there. I parked on the side of the road, and the trail was not marked or anything. This was clearly just some rough path made by random people like me wanting to explore the abandoned lodge. It was very overgrown though, so it looked like nobody had been down there in a while. The hike there took just under 2 hours, and while it was mostly flat, it was a pretty difficult walk because of all the weeds and bushes growing into the path. But regardless, I made it. Now, my plan was to camp inside the lodge, because why not? But I came prepared with a tent and everything, in case it was completely destroyed or something. Good thing I did, because it was clear from the outside that it definitely wasn't safe to camp in. Most of the roof was gone, caving into itself, and the logs it was made of were full of thick vines and mold. The door was wide open though, so I peeked my head inside and looked around. It smelled awful, and with all the decayed and destroyed parts everywhere, there wasn't much access to anything that I could look around. There was a door on the far end of the main hallway that looked intact, and I was trying to get to, but it was a bit too sketchy to get there, so I ended up just backing out. From there, I didn't have anything else planned, but with the sun already starting to set, I began looking around for a good place to set up camp. There really weren't many options, so I basically just walked 200 feet out from the lodge and cleared a small spot to put my tent. As the sun set, the darkness slowly covered the lodge in the distance until I could no longer see it, and all the forest sounds slowly turned into crickets and the warm crackle of the small campfire I built. I really wanted to stargaze, but the spot I was in had trees towering over me, blocking most of the view. Plus, it was partially cloudy. So I just sat there, throwing sticks into the fire and thinking about whatever came to mind. Until I heard something. I don't really know how to describe it, but it was pretty loud, maybe like wood bowing or bending. And even though I couldn't see the lodge anymore, the sound came from right where I knew the lodge was sitting in the dark. It only lasted a few seconds, but it sent chills through me. Maybe it was just the old wood bending and creaking in the wind, or maybe it was something else. I sat and listened for a while, like 30 minutes, without hearing anything else. It was only an hour or so into the night, but I knew if I didn't check on it now, I wouldn't be able to sleep later. So I figured I might as well go look around while it was still early into the night. I fueled up my campfire with some more sticks before leaving, so I wouldn't have to rebuild it. Then I grabbed my small LED lamp and walked in the direction of the lodge. After only a minute of walking, the structure faintly showed up in the lights. It was as creepy as expected. I walked up to it cautiously, passing by a couple destroyed windows and holding the light up. Inside, it was extremely dark. Even with the light, it felt like I could barely see anything. When I got to the door, I was startled for a moment. It was closed. I'd been here less than 2 hours ago and left it wide open. Then I noticed something else. There were scratches, like from nails or maybe a knife, all along the front face of the door. I didn't notice them last time, so I wasn't sure if they were already there or had just happened and were maybe the sound I heard. I debated for a second whether or not I even wanted to try opening it, or if I should just leave. But it was all for nothing, because when I eventually decided to open it, I couldn't. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. I got really unsettled and didn't stay any longer. I backed away from the lodge and rushed back into the woods toward my campsite. However, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Aside from my lantern, there was no light coming from the forest. I started to hurry, hoping I was still going in the right direction. Luckily I was, and a minute later I made it back to my tent. A column of smoke filled the air above what was my campfire, as if someone had just abruptly put it out while it was still burning. I looked around, just standing there holding my lantern up, barely able to see anything in the trees.
Hello? Hello? Who's out there?
Nobody responded. Starting to feel chills run through me again. I knew it was only a 2-hour hike back to where my car was, so I quickly decided to pack and head out. I took down my tent, and as I shoved the few remaining things into my backpack, I heard something nearby. I stopped for a second and held up my lantern, but still saw nothing. It sounded like someone was laughing. It was quiet, and not like someone laughing with their friends or anything. It was a single person, softly laughing under their breath as they watched me from behind the trees in the dark, like they were insane. I hurried up, leaving scraps behind and booking it to the trail. With my crappy lantern, it was really hard to follow the path, but I did the best I could. Several times I stopped, thinking I heard that soft laughing and worried I was being followed. But whoever it was stalking me out there, they were blending in with the dark perfectly, as I never once even caught sight of them. I got back to the road, getting in my car and driving away. I look back at that experience 7 years later as the single most disturbing and horrifying experience of my life. I don't think anyone can truly understand the feeling of helplessness I felt being out there in the forest in the middle of nowhere at night and stalked by some insane person. Maybe they set up home in that abandoned lodge. I really don't know. But from everything I saw and experienced there, I don't think anyone should go back to find out. This was in 2015. I had taken a road trip to a forest a few hours from me. There was a hike up to an abandoned fire lookout that I was really excited to explore. I should mention it was technically illegal to go inside it or camp in it, as it wasn't kept up with and could be structurally unstable. I'd done some research online though, and most people said that it seemed okay, but the last post I could find about it was 3 years ago, so I really didn't know what I'd find when I got up there. Anyway, I found a small ditch on the side of the road that I could park in. Then I got out my backpack with 2 days worth of gear and started the hike. With trips like this, there aren't usually defined paths to get there, so I used a handheld satellite GPS that allowed me to make sure I was going the right way. But really, the whole time I was just cutting through unknown terrain in the woods. The hike from the road was about 4 to 5 hours. The further in I got, the more dense and rough the terrain got. I was really banking on the fire lookout to still be intact and good enough for me to camp out in, but I guess if not, then I was just gonna have to find somewhere else nearby to set up my tent and sleep at. After the pretty tiring several hours of hiking through the woods, I finally got there. I could see the building peeking out above the trees, and when I got closer, it actually looked decently in shape. The paint was worn off, of course, but it seemed to be holding up well. I gave the support beams a few pushes, and they were really solid, so I tried my luck climbing up the ladder. It was metal and felt sturdy, but still creaked with every step up. When I got to the top, I was in awe for a moment at the views. I could see basically the entire forest. There were no buildings or roads or houses for miles in all directions. It was just the woods. After taking in the view, I went around the ledge and inside the lookout. It was really small, not like one of those big ones that you see get turned into Airbnbs or whatever. This was just one room, maybe 150 square feet. It had a decaying bed in the corner and an old wooden desk in the other corner, with rotting windows spanning the entire wall. There wasn't too much else to look at in there, so I put my bag down and rolled out my mattress and sleeping bag, then heated up a meal on my mini camping stove. Once the sun was setting, I walked out to the ledge and watched it. It was by far one of the best views I'd ever seen. I felt like it went by quick though, and then it was just darkness. It was cloudy out too, so no moonlight or stars were lighting up the sky. With nothing else to do though, I stayed sitting out on the ledge for a while. It was probably an hour into the night when I saw something below me. There was a light moving around in the trees. What was strange about it though was it wasn't like an artificial light. It had this orangish hue and was kind of flickering, kind of like a campfire would, which led me to believe it was a torch. It was moving between the trees in the forest, not too far from where I was. The chances of someone else being out here at the same time as me in such a remote part of the woods were really slim, given there wasn't even a trail to get here. Also, traveling around at night without a normal flashlight and using a torch was pretty odd. I watched as the light moved under the trees for a while. Then it went behind something where I could no longer see it. For the next 30 minutes, I never saw it appear again. I still stayed out on the ledge though, taking in the calmness and quietness of the night. Eventually, the wind started to make it a bit cold, so I stood up to take in one last view before heading inside. When I looked below the ledge though, someone was there. They were standing at the bottom in the grassy area between the fire lookout and the woods. It looked like they were looking directly up at me. Maybe it was the person with the light I saw earlier.
Hello?
I called out. I didn't know what else to say. They didn't move or say anything back to me. It was just this strange 10 or 15 seconds of looking at each other before they lifted up their hand, like in an acknowledging way or apologizing. Then they turned around and walked into the woods, still with no light on. Obviously, that was incredibly creepy and eerie, but for some reason in the moment, I felt so sure that it was just another hiker wanting to stay on the lookout. It was probably just looking up, trying to see if anyone was inside already. Why he hesitated to respond and only lifted his hand up, I don't know. I stayed outside for a little longer, but not seeing anything else, I went inside and got my sleeping bag to warm up. It was a little bit hard to fall asleep because of the wind hitting the windows and the wooden beams creaking under me, but eventually I did manage to pass out. It's hard to really know how much time passed, but when I woke up, the wind had settled down and it was still very dark outside. I opened my eyes, wondering why I was suddenly awake, but then I heard a familiar sound. The soft metal creak of the ladder outside. I sat up, thinking I must be mistaken, but then I heard it again and again. Someone was climbing up the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up or down they were. I could just hear the hinges at the top of the ladder creak with every step up they took. Outside the windows, though, it was completely dark. I unzipped my sleeping bag and got up, heart racing as I grabbed my backpack and walked onto the ledge. During the 20 or so seconds that it took to get up, the creaking got louder and faster, like they were hurrying, before it suddenly stopped just as I made it out to the ledge. I stood in place for a moment, waiting for another sound. Then I slowly walked around the walkway and peered around the corner at the opening to the ladder. No one was there. I carefully walked closer and felt my heart rate increasing as I leaned over and looked down. Nobody was on the ladder. I was just in shock for a second, confused and scared and unsure what the hell was going on. Then a sudden sequence of footsteps came rushing around the wooden walkway behind me. I only caught a glimpse of their dark figure running between the windows on the other side. I didn't hesitate to lower myself onto the ladder and hurry down. It was terrifying, trying to climb down the slippery metal ladder as my whole body was shaking from the adrenaline rush, with someone chasing right above me. I got halfway down before I saw their head peer out from above. I didn't stop until I got to the bottom and into the woods. Honestly, I don't know why I even grabbed my backpack when I got up to see what was going on, but it was the best decision I ever made. Maybe even saved my life. With my flashlight and GPS on me, I was able to hike my way out of there and back to my car. As far as I know, I wasn't followed. I drove away and never looked back. I was going on a camping trip with my best friend. I'm gonna call him Henry. We'd done a few trips before, but we still mostly considered ourselves new to it. We hadn't done anything too crazy up until this point. Usually we'd go to local campgrounds that had other people around, but we thought we were confident enough to do something more adventurous. Both of us wanted to camp at an actual campsite that was cool, with a view and further in the forest. You know, like real camping. We did some research and found a place about 3 hours from us. It was a 4-hour hike into the forest, and it only had a couple pictures from previous campers, so it didn't seem like it'd be busy. We drove down there, prepared for 3 days. There was a very small dirt area on the end of an otherwise unused road in the middle of the forest. Nobody else was parked there. The trail looked like an actual trail, or at least it looked like it was one at some point. It hadn't been kept up with, so some parts were overgrown and weathered. I mean, it was in the middle of nowhere, it seemed, so I wasn't expecting the most taken care of trail, but this looked like it was abandoned for years. Still, we kept walking. It thinned out as we got further into the forest, but around mid-afternoon, we got to the campsite. It was no more than a grassy area on top of a small hill, but it had a decent overlook of the forest and was very secluded. Nobody else was there, and from the looks of it, nobody had been there in a long time. We set up our tents and got everything unpacked. Henry was taking a bit longer than me, so while I waited, I walked up to the overlook and just enjoyed the view. While I was there, I noticed something move in the trees below us. It was really hard to see through the dense branches and leaves, but I barely caught a glimpse of a group of people walking, maybe 4 or 5 of them. I was so surprised to see other people out here, especially not on the campsite. From where I was though, I couldn't see anything aside from their basic figures moving through the forest, so I couldn't tell if they were campers or hikers or what. I tried to point them out to Henry, but by the time he came over, they were already gone, disappeared in the forest. After a few minutes, we were back to going about our day. We kind of just hung out for the next few hours, talking and whatever, until the sun started going down. We built up a small campfire and sat around it. The night was calm for the first couple hours. It was quiet, only the sound of us talking and the crackling campfire between us. But then we heard something else. It was faint, but we both heard it. It sounded like voices, multiple, talking back and forth. We couldn't tell what they were saying, or even if they were speaking our language. It was coming from way out in the trees though, which made it really creepy. Henry and I didn't know what to do, so we just listened for a bit, but the voices didn't seem to move. They stayed in the same spot out there, until they suddenly went quiet. The next minute or so was really unnerving. We didn't hear the voices fade out or leave. They just stopped, like they were still right out there. Then there were footsteps, just one set walking toward us. A few seconds later, a man came out of the dark and into the light of our campfire. He had a distinct red baseball cap and longish, wavy black hair. His smile was wide as he walked up to us.
Either of you know where the trail is around here? I've been looking for a while.
I said yeah and pointed ahead at the trail. But when he didn't immediately say anything or leave, I then asked if the others out there were with him. His face fell flat for a moment. Then he smiled again and looked back at where I was looking.
I didn't know there were others out here. I've just been hiking alone. I would have asked them for directions if I saw them.
The man said. It was really strange though. I was almost sure he was lying. He came from the same direction we just heard the voices in. I just said okay, and he smiled, then left and went down the trail. Henry was thinking the exact same thing as I was, that the guy was lying for some reason. There was no way he just came out from the same area as the group of voices and wasn't with them, or at least didn't even notice them. But the more unsettling question is, why was he lying? Why didn't he want to tell us about the others in the forest? We discussed this around the campfire for a while, maybe 30 minutes, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, or if there even was something going on. The whole time, it felt like we were being watched. I kept turning around and looking at the forest and at the trail. Something felt wrong. It definitely didn't help that this was our first time being so far out like this, so nerves were already high.
Should we just leave?
Henry finally said in a shaken voice. After some thought, I said yes. We started packing, but that eerie feeling only felt like it was getting stronger. Just as we tossed our bags on our shoulders and stomped out the campfire, a single footstep crunched in the leaves behind me. We both swung our heads around. Without the fire, it was pitch black. It also felt like the woods were eerily quiet now. After a moment, my shaky hand reached into the side of my backpack and got out my flashlight. I pointed it out and clicked it on. Standing only 10 or 15 feet in front of me was that same guy from before with the red baseball hat. He was standing in place, already looking at us, and had a blank stare. As I held the light on him, he made that same wide smile from before. In a panic, I turned off the light and both of us sprinted to the trail. Disturbingly, I could hear multiple other footsteps chasing behind us, and some even sounding like they were running through the woods beside us. Slowly though, they started to fade out. Eventually, it was just us two, running down the dark trail. We made it back to the car unharmed. We got in and drove away. We were both pretty shaken for a while after that. Honestly, I have no idea what was going on there. Why was anyone there at all? It's been a long time since this happened, but we haven't been out camping at all. I don't know if we ever will. This was in 2019, when I was 21. I was spending the summer at my parents' house, and figured I'd go camping in the woods in their backyard while I had the chance. This was a pretty impulsive trip. I just decided one morning I'd pack my bag and head out for the night. I'd done it a bunch of times before, so this wasn't some special camping trip or anything. I let my parents know where I was headed, then left at 4 p.m. to find a spot for the night. I walked for a good hour before finding an open area that looked nice enough. I got my tent set up, cleared out a space, and lit up a small campfire. It was really cozy, and the sun slowly setting made it even better. Exactly the kind of night I was hoping for. But it really didn't take that long for it to get interrupted. The sun was just about to pass the top of the trees when I heard a voice. A male voice, sort of muttering or talking. I almost felt like it was echoing a bit though, because it was hard to pinpoint exactly where the voice was coming from. It was also dark enough where the shadows from all the trees made it really hard to see much of anything. I probably should have mentioned these woods behind my parents' place were pretty vast and unexplored, as in there were no trails around here. So running into someone would have to be very coincidental. I thought they'd likely just pass by and that would be the end of it, but I continued hearing the voice for probably 5 minutes, which was long enough that it seemed they weren't just walking and were maybe staying near me on purpose. Eventually, I called out, just yelling hello to see if they'd respond. But before I even finished speaking the word, the voice cut out. The forest was now silent. I felt really uncomfortable and ended up calling out again. No voice or response. Now I was a little more on the creeped out side. With only 20 or 30 minutes left of the thin layer of sunlight, I decided I would just move spots. No need to stay there and be creeped out all night and let it ruin my experience. Within a couple minutes, I was heading back into the trees and looking for another place to call home for the night. I didn't have as much luck though. 15 minutes in, with the fading sunlight rushing me, I decided to just settle where I was. Basically just among all the trees. It was a good thing I did though, because by the time I finished setting up camp, there was no light left. The sun was fully down, and the woods were dead silent. I found it calming though, knowing I'd be able to hear if that guy came back around, for whatever reason. I built up another small campfire. I enjoyed the warmth for a while, before grabbing my snack bag and taking out some stuff to make s'mores. I got a small stick and stabbed a marshmallow on the top and held it over the fire. I don't know what it was about it, but roasting a marshmallow over a campfire is just one of my favorite things to do. It helped get my mind off of things. I made a few s'mores and hung around the fire for a good long while, several hours at least. It was pretty late by then, and I was letting the fire begin dying out. It was still somewhat bright, but only half as much as it was before. But then I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. I thought it sounded like somewhere to the back left of my campsite. It was completely dark though, and once I was looking over there, whatever it was had stopped moving. Again, I called out. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much, considering how last time went. But a few moments later, a man stepped out of the woods and into the light. Though it startled me, because he came from a different area than what I was looking at.
Didn't mean to scare ya.
He said with a smile as he casually walked up to the fire and sat next to it. He held his hands out to warm them by the fire. He acted as if he were supposed to be there, or like he knew me or something.
Can I help you? I think you're at the wrong campsite.
I said.
No.
I didn't know which part he was saying no to, but either way, it was an unsettling response to not add anything to. I sort of had to think for a few seconds about what to do or say, so there was a very strange, tense little bit as we both sat by the fire, not speaking. It got so tense that I sort of just asked whatever came to mind, which in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have.
Do you happen to be the one I heard talking out in the trees around my other campsite earlier?
The man stayed looking at the fire, but his face visibly fell flat.
Must have been someone else.
He said with a much colder, monotone voice. Something was extremely off about all this, but I still didn't know how to get out of it without risking causing trouble. Before I was able to think too much about it, a stick cracked behind me. I looked back. It was from the same spot to the back left of the campsite. My heart sank. The man wasn't alone. Someone else was here. I turned and looked back toward the campfire. He was staring at me. To be perfectly honest, I don't even remember whether he was smiling or angry or what, because all I remember was the intense, cold, and dead look in his eyes. I instantly sprung up from my chair and made a dead sprint into the trees. I heard one of the men say something, clearly talking to the other in frustration, and momentarily I heard footsteps running up behind me. However, as I got deeper into the woods and into the darkness, I lost them. Having grew up in these woods as my backyard, I was still able to somewhat navigate through them and to the road, following it back to my parents' house. They called 911 for me. Long story short, I led a team of officers to the campsite in the morning. Everything was gone. I don't know if that makes things better or worse. On one hand, it could have meant they were just there to rob me. But on the other hand, it made it definite that they had bad intentions, so they really could have been trying to do anything. After all, one of them did chase me for a minute. Shouldn't surprise anyone to say I never went back in those woods behind my parents' house. This was last year in the summer. I was out on a trail backpacking to a small camping spot with my dog Rocky. He's an Australian Shepherd, so a medium-sized, really smart dog that comes with me everywhere I go, always loving running around and hiking through the woods. This place we were headed to was one I'd been to 3 or 4 times before. I loved it because it was isolated and never had anyone else, so Rocky could be free to run around off-leash and enjoy himself. The campsite was 8 hours down trail, so by the time we got there, it was just an hour or two before sunset. The campsite itself wasn't anything special or picturesque. It was just a small opening with nothing but trees all around. I found it calming and nice to hang out in, and safe for me to let Rocky roam around while still being able to keep an eye on him. I tossed my pack down and started to set everything up, which is when Rocky usually does his little patrol around the campsite. I saw him sniffing around and go a little ways into the woods, while I continued to put our tent up, then unpack the rest of the things into the inside of the tent. About 15 minutes after arriving, Rocky came back to the campsite, but he was acting strange. His tail was down, and he came right up to me, then turned and faced the direction he just came from, looking out into the woods. I almost never see him act like this, unless there was a thunderstorm or something he was afraid of. I stood up and looked out where he came from, but saw nothing. I then checked him, making sure he didn't step on something and hurt himself, but he was completely fine, just anxious for some reason. It was pretty off-putting, especially from a smart and capable dog like Rocky was. I kept on the lookout as I finished setting up the camp and getting the campfire built. As I did, Rocky never left my side, not to explore or anything, just followed me around and kept his eyes on the woods. I will say, every time I looked back to check the woods, I felt a strange, uneasy sense, like I was being watched. I put it off as Rocky just making me nervous, since I didn't actually see anything, but it never really left my mind. I got the campfire going just as the sun fell past the top of the trees, covering the woods in a dark shadow. It was quiet, as it always was, but I didn't feel as calm as I usually did. I figured I wouldn't, though, because of Rocky's unusual behavior, but hoped tomorrow things would be more normal and we could go back to enjoying our time. For the night, though, I just tended the fire and hung out with Rocky beside me, listening to the sounds of the forest. But then, just about an hour past sunset, Rocky suddenly perked his head up and froze. He stared anxiously out at the trees, ears up and tail between his legs. I looked out, but the darkness engulfed the area, making anything past 20 or 30 feet completely concealed. He started quietly whining, locking his gaze at the darkness behind the trees. Trusting him that something was wrong, I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out there. Not seeing much, I started to walk a little further in. Rocky followed closely behind me. I didn't want to venture too far away from the campfire, but from the maybe 50 feet I walked out, I saw nothing in the woods. We went back and sat down. Even though I didn't see anything, I knew Rocky wouldn't be doing this for no reason. But it seemed most likely, and I guess I just hoped, that it was just an animal of some kind, walking around the area. We weren't in bear territory, but I still carried bear spray on me, which would work on any animal, so I wasn't too worried for our safety. Rocky stayed on high alert all night, but didn't have any more sudden moments, and a couple hours later, we got in the tent and went to bed. I could tell Rocky was tired, probably from all the anxiety he was going through, and I was glad to see him close his eyes and fall asleep within 15 minutes. I did the same soon after. This might sound strange, but during that night, I remember having a dream about walking through the woods at night. I was alone, Rocky wasn't with me, and I was just walking through the trees, not on a path or anything. In the middle of that dream, I started to hear a high-pitched noise. Over and over, it kept going, until suddenly I shot awake. Rocky was nudging my face with his snout and whining in my ear, making that high-pitched noise I was hearing in my dream, immediately making me realize that he'd been trying to wake me for a while. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, feeling the nerves as I unzipped the tent and stepped out to look around. I turned on the flashlight, prepared to scan the area, but immediately when the light came on, it lit up a person right in front of me, like maybe 10 feet away from the tent. They had all black clothes on, with a hoodie draping over half of their face, only showing their distressed beard. I quickly noticed a reflection coming from his hand though, seeing the small blade of a pocket knife shining the light back at me. In that instant, I just froze up, like my whole body went through a sudden shock. The man froze for a moment too, but then started to step forward again, when Rocky began growling. Up until then, I hadn't even noticed that he'd come out of the tent and was standing right next to me. This made the man hesitate, giving me more time to collect myself and quickly reach into the tent for the bear spray. By the time I was back up, Rocky was aggressively barking and moving back and forth, putting himself between us. The man didn't take any more steps forward and just turned and ran into the woods. Thankfully, Rocky didn't chase after him. I started taking everything down and packing as he kept his head up and circled around the campsite, guarding the whole area. Once packed, we started back down the trail. Honestly, even with my adrenaline still flowing through the entire hike back, I wasn't all that scared, knowing how well Rocky handled the situation. We made it back safely and got out of there. I did what I could to report the incident, but I think because of the location and everything, it wasn't really investigated. Anyway, I've gone on several camping trips since then, and Rocky was back to his normal self, happy and exploring the forests as usual. At least now I know that if he doesn't trust something, it's best to just get out of there. I was hiking to a fairly well-known overlook just outside of Glacier National Park in Montana. It definitely wasn't as great as any of the views within Glacier National Park, but it was just a normal trail with no rules or anything. Also, it was just before winter, which around here is off-season for most hiking and camping, which meant nobody would be out. I didn't mind the cold, so it was nice to have the trail and the overlook to myself. I finished hiking up there at just about 5:30, so it took nearly 6 hours. Pretty much, there was this large grassy opening on top of the mountain with a couple stone circles for making campfires and setting up camp around, and a little further up was a stone cliff that provided a view of the whole valley of mountains and forest. You could actually probably see Glacier National Park from there on a good clear day. Anyway, as expected, nobody else was at the campsite or at the overlook. I set up all my stuff by the stone circle closest to the overlook and made myself a quick dinner, then went to sit on the edge of the cliff to watch the sunset. I will say there was a bit of a drop below the overlook, which was kind of daunting at first, but the sun setting over the mountains made me completely forget about it. I sat there and watched it for a whole 30 minutes, until it passed the horizon and got dark outside. Feeling good, I got up and turned to walk back to my campsite, but almost jumped back when I saw a man standing right behind me in the bushes near the edge of the forest. He was looking right at me, but what made it really creepy was as soon as I saw him, he just turned around and left right away. I couldn't see much of him since it was pretty dark out, and he was in the bushes, but the man had no backpack on, so I thought he must have gotten to the campsite just after me and set up his stuff already. From where I was on the overlook, I could really only see my setup and none of the other parts of the campsite. But when I got closer, I still didn't see anything else, and the way the guy went into the forest was not in the direction of the campsite either. I thought it was really weird, but went on with my night. I put some dry sticks into the stone circle and lit up a campfire, then set up my mini camping chair and sat by the fire. I didn't have much else to do that night. I honestly had no plan for this trip. I just wanted to come out here and relax all day and night and enjoy the forest. So that's what I tried to do. Several hours went by. I think it was getting to be around 11 p.m. when I heard footsteps somewhere in front of me. Of course, I couldn't see anything, but it sounded eerily like human footsteps, one after the other, not too far away in the woods. Pretty soon after hearing them, I called out, asking if someone was out there. The footsteps stopped for a moment, like they hesitated, and then began walking again. But whatever it was out there, they didn't respond. Even though it sounded exactly like human footsteps, without being able to see them, and without them responding, I had to believe that it was just an animal, like maybe a deer or something. Because if it was a person, surely they'd respond, but also it made no sense for anyone to be walking around right now. Eventually, the steps faded out though. Another hour went by as I sat by the campfire. I didn't think the footsteps had me too nervous or scared, but they must have, because I was still very awake, like definitely not able to sleep, even though it was past midnight already. After a while, I knew I wasn't going to bed anytime soon, and I was getting bored, so I walked out to the overlook to see if maybe the stars were out. I left the fire going and got up, walking over to the cliff. The skies weren't too clear. However, the moon was shining down enough to cast a glowing light over the mountains and forest. The breeze was calming and quiet, moving across the valley. I stood there for maybe a minute, before suddenly multiple sticks snapped behind me and a bush aggressively rustled. I spun around, seeing that same man from earlier, but he didn't turn away this time. He moved through the bush and started quickly walking up to the overlook. I began asking what he was doing out here, but the guy just talked over me, holding this disturbing fake smile as he kept moving closer, saying random nonsense and keeping from answering any of my questions. or even acknowledging anything that I said. The way he was coming at me was terrifying, and I tried to move to the side, but he was quick to get back in front of me. And suddenly, in the heat of the moment, I realized what was about to happen. He put his hands out and lunged at me, trying to push me over the ledge. Thank God I was prepared for it and had a stable footing, and I was a bit bigger than the guy, so I shoved him back and moved away from the cliff. As he stumbled, I tried to run back to the campsite, but he caught up pretty quick. This time, he didn't try to hide his intent. His face was horrifyingly angry and full of rage. I can't even imagine how lucky I was that this guy didn't have any form of weapon on him, because he definitely wouldn't have hesitated to use it. We wrangled around for maybe 30 seconds, but I kept getting the better of him. The guy was pretty skinny, like he hadn't eaten in a while, but he was just dead set on taking me down. After a few attempts, though, he was finally beaten enough to run away. I didn't even try chasing or keeping him pinned. Way out here, it just wasn't worth the risk. I got everything together, put on my headlamp, and left the campsite. I made it about 2 hours back down the trail before my headlamp's batteries ran out, so I set up a mini camp in the woods and waited for sunrise, then finished the hike back. I put a report in and talked to a lot of people about my encounter, but everyone has different thoughts as to what the man was really doing out there. All I know is I could have lost my life that night had I been any less careful. Behind my neighborhood is a decent-sized forest with plenty of trails for hiking and camping. I frequented a lot of them, but often found I enjoyed the experience way better when nobody else was around. I avoided all the major campgrounds and preferred to tent camp along some of the backpacking trails. I did this camping trip sometime near the end of autumn, as I remember all the trees were leafless, and it was starting to get colder outside with each passing day. I thought I'd be fine for at least 1 or 2 more trips before winter though. I set out on a hike at midday. No cars or people were anywhere near the trailhead, and along the 8-mile hike I didn't see anyone at all. I think most people were probably done for the hiking and camping season. It was quite a bit colder than I expected, but I came prepared with heavy jackets and a -20-degree sleeping bag, which was more than enough for what I was doing. Eventually, I came across an open spot that looked like a nice place to set up for the night. It was just a bit off the beaten trail, and I'm pretty sure I'd actually camped there once or twice before, so I felt comfortable as I got my tent up, built a small fire ring, and got a campfire going. I made a hot cup of decaf to help me warm up as I sat right next to the fire. With the sun going down, it started to get colder and colder. There was a bit of a breeze too, throwing cold wind in my face, and honestly making the experience more miserable than I was hoping for. And there was something else. I kept seeing something in the distance, like way out in the trees. It was far enough to blend in with everything, all the dry branches and bushes, so I didn't know what it was. But it was like whatever or whoever it was staying perfectly far enough to keep me from seeing them. Only their movement between all the trees was visible, and with the sun getting lower and lower, it only made me feel more uneasy. The feeling that I was being stalked was creeping into my head, but I tried to shut it down. I didn't want to believe that that was even a possibility. I really hoped it wasn't even a person at all, and was just a deer or harmless animal roaming around its territory. An hour after sundown, and with night overhead, the uneasy feeling, mixed with the chilling cold winds, made me really uncomfortable. I thought maybe fixing one of those problems would help, so I moved into the tent and inside my sleeping bag to warm up. I left the opening unzipped, with the flap tied to the top so I could still get a little bit of warmth from the campfire, and watch the flames as I laid inside. It definitely helped me stay warm, but only being able to see what was directly in front of me wasn't all that great. Plus, beyond maybe 10 feet of the campfire, it was just complete blackout. I want to say, too, that I'd been camping for years, so this feeling of being alone in the woods at night wasn't unfamiliar. And yet, this was the only time I'd ever felt this way. Everyone always says when you get a bad sense or feel something is off, you should just pack up and leave without questioning it. I was naive enough to think I'd never get that feeling, and even worse, I was stupid not to listen to it. I stayed in the tent, curled up in my sleeping bag and watching the fire. A good 2 or 3 hours went by. Nothing really changed, except it got colder. But as I laid there, I started to hear what sounded like cracking footsteps across the woods. It was coming from behind my tent, the one area I couldn't see at all. I wanted to get up and look, but I sort of froze up, the panic setting in as I let my mind try to think of every possible way that what I was hearing was something other than what it was. The footsteps crept closer and closer, getting maybe 5 to 10 feet away from the back of the tent, before it suddenly went quiet. The crunching stopped, and the sounds of the campfire and wind blowing through the woods filled the void. My heart was pounding in my chest. Embarrassingly, I think I stayed frozen in place for a whole minute before the pain and anxiety of knowing someone was right behind my tent became too much to bear. In one swift motion, I unzipped my sleeping bag, grabbed my flashlight, and jumped out of the tent, shining the light directly at the woods behind me. Nothing. No one was there. Somehow, this actually made me panic even more. I never heard any footsteps walking away, so honestly, a part of me thought I was going crazy. I must have stood there swiveling around and shining the flashlight in every direction for 15 minutes, listening to every sound the woods made, and being completely indecisive about what to do. Whether to pack and try to run out of the forest in the dark, or camp it out and just keep watch. I was freezing though, and the fire was running low on fuel. After a while, I decided to pack. Wasn't sure yet if I'd leave or stay around the campsite, but packing seemed like a good idea either way. As soon as I began taking down my tent, a flurry of footsteps moved from the dark area just behind it. I thought I might have seen a bit of them running away too, but with the flickering campfire casting shadows on everything, I couldn't say for sure. I quickly packed up, stopping every few seconds to look around. I was completely paranoid. After a few minutes, I managed to get everything stuffed into my bag. I tossed it over my shoulders, and before I could stomp out the fire, a man appeared across from me. He walked up quickly, approaching the light. He was on the taller and larger side, with some torn-up jeans and a dirty fleece jacket, and a black beanie on his head. He looked around 40 and had heavy, distant eyes.
Leaving so late. Way too cold to be running out into the dark like that.
He spoke in a gravelly, firm voice. I didn't even respond, taking a few steps back. The man looked like he was trying to figure out how to keep me there. But once I started to get further away, I could see in his face that he realized he wasn't in control. His eyes grew into this unsettling stare. I turned and just started running, straight into the trees. Could barely see where I was going, but I could hear the man's footsteps coming up behind me. After about 30 seconds though, I'd either run too far for him to follow, or he just stopped chasing. I still ran for 15 more minutes, just to be safe and get as much distance as possible. But then I was lost. It was pitch black, and there was no way for me to know which way would take me back to the trail. And even if I went the right way, I'd probably not be able to see the trail in the dark. So I sat up against a tree in the middle of the darkness and just waited. Hours passed as I sat there shivering. The whole forest was silent and still pitch black. I swear, though, a couple of times I heard something moving in the distance, out in the trees, like the guy was walking around looking for me still. I just remained quiet and waited for the sun to come up, allowing me to see where I was and make my way back. I made it out unharmed, which I honestly think is a miracle. I think that guy had some really nasty intentions that I narrowly escaped from. He'd likely been stalking me all night, waiting for a moment to do something. Why it all unfolded the way it did, I don't know. I was driving from northern Montana all the way up to Alaska. I'd converted my SUV into a camping rig and was spending 2 months traveling and camping out of it. And the main goal of those 2 months was to drive the Alaska Highway. This road was famous for a reason, though. It went through the western portion of Canada and was very desolate and rough. I knew that beforehand, so I came in as prepared as possible for the journey. Of everything to be nervous about, though, the one thing that had me feeling a bit more vulnerable was that because I had to drive through Canada, I couldn't bring any firearm with me. Usually, I always carried a piece tucked under my seat just as a means to protect myself in an emergency. But for this trip, I couldn't. Anyway, the first day went well. I got in a good 8 hours of driving. Most of this section of the road was a little less desolate than the next portion. This next part only had a gas station every couple hundred miles, so I had to stop and fill up every single time and be very careful about how I drove. By sundown, I was just about ready to pass out. I pulled off on the next campsite I saw. Out on the road, there were rest stops every once in a while, but there were also a ton of trails that just had empty, wooded camping lots. Those were the ones I always preferred. Since it was already late, though, I didn't see much of the lot I pulled into. It just looked like forest all around me, and nobody else was there. So I put up my window shades, hopped in the back seat, and slept until morning. Everything seemed fine. I got good sleep and didn't wake up at all during the night. Before hitting the road again, though, I wanted to stretch my legs and get a walk in. Right when I stepped outside, I noticed a trail, so I decided to follow it. It wasn't very long, though. I think I walked maybe 5 minutes before getting to another campsite, but something didn't feel right about it. It was scrappy and rugged. Clearly someone had been there recently, and it sort of looked like they left in a hurry. Half of their stuff was missing, and the other half was torn up and thrown across the site. After only being there for 30 seconds, I turned around and headed back. I didn't know if someone was still around, but I trusted my gut and walked back to my car. When I got back, though, there was now a truck parked right up next to my car. It was an all-black pickup truck with tinted windows. Nobody was outside of it, so I assumed they were inside watching me as I got up to my car and got in. With the strange campsite and the sudden truck parked near me out in the middle of such an isolated road in the forest, I just left right away. I didn't even have to think about whether or not something was actually wrong, because getting out of there quickly was the obvious answer. I drove for 3 to 4 hours straight after leaving that campsite until I got to the next gas station. I pulled in. This gas station looked very old and only had one double-sided pump. Nobody else was there. I got out and started the pump. I have to say, the views were incredible out there, with mountains in every direction, so I didn't mind waiting a while for the slow gas pump to fill the car. However, after a few minutes, I saw a truck coming down the road. As it got closer, I was almost sure it was the same black truck I'd seen at the campsite. My stomach tightened when they pulled into the gas station and right up to the other side of the pump. Of course, it made sense they'd be getting gas, as you kinda had to at every stop on this road, but it still felt a little strange. Why would they have pulled into the campsite and only stayed there for a few minutes, just to leave right after I did? Thankfully, I was done in 30 seconds, getting back in and driving off. I think part of what made it all feel so off was that I never saw the guy. He never got out of the truck or showed himself, so it just made it all feel a little more unusual. Regardless, I felt good knowing now that my tank was full. I'd be driving non-stop for a while, likely putting a ton of distance between us and getting to just enjoy the scenery. Also, I'd hopefully be ahead enough to find a campsite during the day, so I wouldn't be parking anywhere blind like I did the previous night. I drove a long while, pretty much until I noticed the sun start coming down. Then I found a decent spot to pull off. It felt a little more hidden. The trail sort of nestled away in the brush, and there weren't any signs of anyone having been here recently, so it definitely wasn't a popular place to camp. I felt a lot more safe here than I did before. I really wanted to set up my tent and have a nice outdoor campsite, as it was way more spacious than sleeping all cramped up in the back of my car. But something in me told me not to, just in case. So I just made food outside and enjoyed the nature until sundown, then got back in my car. The next day was hopefully going to be shorter than the last two, and knowing that, I decided to stay up and watch some videos on my phone that I had downloaded. I was there, awake for probably 4 hours. I felt very comfortable there, and was actually really excited to be getting into Alaska tomorrow morning. But then, around 11 p.m., I heard something outside my car. Even from just a second of listening, I was 100% sure it was a person walking. The dry sticks and leaves made it very loud and distinct. I quickly put my phone down and sat up to look out the window, but I was beat to it. A man's face was pressed up against the side window, staring in at me. I could barely see him, but there was no mistaking that that was what I was seeing. I jolted back, losing my breath from the instant fear. They also moved back, disappearing into the void of darkness just past the window. I immediately jumped up to the front seat, seeing the second guy that I'd heard walking, running up to the car. He smashed open the back window just as I got to the front. My adrenaline flowing made it hard to do the simple task of getting my keys out and starting the car. That, on top of also looking back at what the men were doing. One of them was running up to my driver window, while the other was sticking their arm through the broken window to try opening the door from the inside. In the panic, I somehow managed to get the keys into the ignition and turn it on right as he opened the back door. I floored the car. As I pulled out, I passed by that same black truck parked off the path, sort of hidden in the bushes. They had followed me all this way. I drove a mile or so, then pulled off to close the back door that was still hanging open, and to call the police with what little cell service I had. Obviously, out in the middle of nowhere, it took forever, and the men were probably long gone. I never got their license plates, and it was too dark to get any facial features, so it was a lost cause. Despite the horrible experience, I still ended up making it to Alaska and enjoying the rest of my trip after repairing the window. What both of the men were intending to do, breaking into a car in the middle of the woods at night, knowing I was inside, is left to speculation. I prefer to not even think about it. In 2019, I drove down to my older brother's cabin to watch his dog while he was away. He was just going on a 3-day work trip and didn't want to leave his dog, Cooper, with someone they weren't familiar with. I call my brother's place a cabin, but really it was a normal, fairly sized home. I only called it a cabin because it was nestled away in the middle of the woods. The first day I spent hanging out and catching up with my brother before he left around 3 that afternoon. There wasn't all that much to do at his cabin, aside from relaxing and maybe listening to music by the fireplace. After eating dinner, I figured it'd be nice to sit outside and watch the sunset by a campfire, so I brought Cooper out with me, and we chilled in the yard by the campfire as the sun slowly fell behind the trees. It was really nice, at least for the first hour. I found out pretty quick, though, that it was not quite as calming once the sun was down. It was actually extremely creepy. Everything around the cabin got completely dark, and the quietness of the woods was just eerie. Not even 10 minutes after the sun was gone, I put out the campfire and went back inside. Maybe it just wasn't for me, but I honestly hated the creepy feeling of being out there at night. I sat on the couch with Cooper, and ironically, turned on a horror movie. The long drive to the cabin had me pretty tired though, and during the whole film I was in and out of sleep. However, at one point I woke up and Cooper wasn't beside me anymore. I sat up and looked around, seeing him sitting by the front door. I called his name, but as I did, I realized how weird it was. Cooper didn't look like he happened to just be chilling there. He was sitting upright, head forward, facing and staring at the front door. "Cooper? You okay, Coop?" He looked back at me, but only for a second. Then he looked back at the door. I got up and walked over to him, patting him on the side and looking out the peephole of the front door. I didn't see anything. I cracked it open and stuck my head out. It was still too dark to see clearly, but there didn't seem to be anything out there. No sounds of any animals walking around either. I closed the door and went back to Cooper, figuring a deer or something must have passed by a few minutes ago. Now is probably a good time to mention that Coop was a young German Shepherd mix, so definitely a smart dog. I didn't doubt that he had smelled or heard something, but I thought it had to be a harmless animal wandering near the cabin. I finished the movie and went to bed not long after. In the morning, I took Cooper outside and mostly just had a calm morning, sipping on my coffee and relaxing outside. I tried going for a walk, but I was hesitant to go too far out, worried about getting lost in the forest, so I just stayed by the cabin. As the sun eventually went down, I headed back inside to avoid the darkness, and did pretty much the same thing as the previous night. I laid on the couch and turned on a movie. Cooper was laying with me for a while, but ended up wandering the rest of the house to pass the time. Completely out of nowhere though, I heard his loud, deep barking coming from behind me. I jumped up and yelled his name as I hurried into the kitchen. Cooper was standing with his tail between his legs and hair sticking up on his back, aggressively barking at seemingly nothing at all. I tried to calm him down, but even when I got him to stop barking, I couldn't keep him from continuing this low, deep growl. I had no idea what happened or what spooked him. There was nothing in the kitchen. There was only a window above the counters, but it was too high up for Coop to even see out of. I told Cooper it was alright, using a soft voice to hopefully settle him down. Then I let him back into the living room to sit on the couch with me. It seemed like I was just able to settle him down for a moment, before there was a sudden hollow tapping sound coming right back from the kitchen we were just in. Of course, this made Coop start barking again, but this time I didn't tell him to stop, because honestly, I was pretty freaked out. I got up and went back to the kitchen. Nothing was there. The tapping I heard sounded like the hollow thump of tapping on the outside of a window, so naturally I went up to the kitchen window and looked out. There really wasn't anything to see. I didn't know what to think at this point. Was it a raccoon or something trying to find a way in? Or was it me just not being used to the sounds of being in a cabin in a forest? What worried me most was that Cooper also seemed on edge. Like if it were just normal sounds, then why was he freaking out so much? It was getting pretty late though, and I thought maybe moving to the bedroom would help us cool off. There was a small TV in there as well, so I continued the movie and watched in bed. Coop sat next to me, ears up and attentive the entire rest of the night. It was about 11 p.m. when I turned off all the lights in the cabin and started getting ready for bed. I let Cooper sleep in the room with me, so I closed the door and filled up his water bowl, then got in the shower to wash off before bed. Even though there were a few strange instances, I was still enjoying my time at the cabin and was looking forward to getting in bed and waking up to enjoy my last day there. But as I was rinsing off, there were a sudden few thumps against the wall, followed by Cooper barking again. I quickly turned off the water and threw on my clothes, rushing out into the room. Cooper wasn't there, and the bedroom door was now open. Coop was smart, but opening doors seemed like a stretch. I could hear his barks moving further through the cabin. I ran into the hallway and down to the other end, immediately seeing the front door was open. I didn't even have time to think because I saw Cooper barking and running away from the cabin into the woods. Within seconds, he was gone. I could only hear the faint sounds of his barking, getting further and further away. I grabbed a flashlight from the front closet, then sprinted after him. It felt like as soon as I was in the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees, I suddenly couldn't hear Coop barking anymore. Once I realized that, I stood still and kind of froze up. The forest was almost completely silent, just a quiet breeze rustling the branches above me.
Cooper? Coop! Cooper!
I called out for Cooper several times, yelling his name and hoping he'd leave whoever the hell he was chasing and just come back to me. I must have been out there for an entire 5 horrifying minutes before I heard leaves rustling ahead of me. A moment later, Coop came running toward me, his tail tucked and this look of fear all over his face, and I could hear quiet whimpers as he stared back at the darkness he just came from. I made sure he followed as I ran back toward the cabin and got us back inside. I called 911, then my brother as I waited for help to get there. Afterward, we stayed in a hotel for the night until my brother got back the following day. Unfortunately, there wasn't much follow-up. Someone was definitely stalking the cabin, likely for the multiple days I was there at least, and had somehow broken in, only to be chased out by Coop once they entered the bedroom. What's happened out there in the dark forest while Cooper was alone, I honestly don't know, but poor Coop was apparently terrified for weeks after that. Thankfully, he seemed to recover though. That was definitely the most horrifying and intense experience of my life, and if not for Cooper chasing them away, I don't know if I'd be here right now. Being over 6 years since then, Coop has gotten older, pushing 10 years old now. I still love getting to see him every time I visit my brother, and even though he's not my dog, I still love him and appreciate what he did for me that night at the cabin, and for keeping my brother safe from whoever is still out there. This happened just 2 weeks ago on a backpacking trip I was on, the first one of the summer for me. As far as I was aware, I was going on a very routine backpacking trip through a trail in northeastern Wyoming. The trail was a 2-day hike there and a 2-day hike back the same way. I'd done a ton of trails similar to this, so I went into it thinking it'd just be a typical few days. I parked at the empty trailhead and started walking. First few hours went well. The route was quiet, and I felt like I was making good time. I only had 3 miles left before I'd reach the first campsite, which I'd actually just be passing through and going straight to the next one 2 miles further, which would be where I'd camp at for that night. Feeling a bit hungry and finding a nice spot for a break, I sat against a tree on the side of the trail and pulled out a snack. I was just taking a breather, only wanting to eat real quick and then get back to walking. But as I sat there, I happened to look up and see something kind of creepy. There was a guy standing in the woods, off the other side of the trail, and he was staring at me. Not walking or anything, just staring. I had no idea how long he'd been there for. Almost as soon as I made eye contact with him, he lifted his hand and did this really strange wave, like he was trying to show he was friendly, but the wave was almost robotic. It was just really strange looking and creepy, especially with him standing out there and staring at me. I decided to just stand up and continue down the trail. I was sure he was up to nothing, but I figured it was best to leave anyway. I didn't know why he was off the trail or what he was doing, and as long as I wasn't around him, I didn't care. Those next 3 miles were a little more difficult than I expected, taking me almost 2 hours before I reached the campsite. Like I said, this was the one I was just passing through, but with my break being cut short earlier, I decided to use this as a chance to make a bigger meal and take a longer break before making the final trek to my actual camp for the night. I set my backpack down and took out my mini propane cooker to heat up some water and make my freeze-dried food. I got it to a boil and poured it in, and as I was just waiting for it to cook, I heard footsteps coming down the trail. I looked over. It was the same man I'd seen in the woods. He had short black hair, a medium beard, and a gray flannel with blue jeans, and he looked like he was maybe in his mid-30s to early 40s. As he walked up, I noticed he had a grin on his face, which I assume was supposed to seem friendly, but it definitely didn't. He must have started walking here right after I did, for him to get here so soon. As he walked up, he said hello and started small talk, asking about the hike and whatever. I gave short answers, hoping he'd continue along the trail, but my heart sank when he came right up next to me and sat down. He was acting way too friendly, to the point where it felt like he was being aggressively friendly, like there was no way he was genuine. He was really starting to creep me out. I tried to eat my meal quickly, but the guy kept asking me questions about it. At one point, he was jokingly mocking me for eating a quote, homeless meal, and said I needed better nutrition. He tried handing me an opened protein bar. I kid you not, he pulled it out of his backpack and the wrapper was already opened, but no bites or anything were taken out of it. I turned it down, obviously, but he was being really pushy about it. Eventually, he gave up though, saying that he was going to be staying the night at this campsite too, so he will give it to me later when I'm hungry. Hearing that was an instant relief. He was staying at this campsite. All I had to do was get out of here. I finished eating, then said my friend was waiting for me at the next campsite, so I had to go. The guy held his smile, but I could tell there was nothing behind it. His whole face was flat. He was just holding this ingenuous smile, and it was really creepy. I walked away, checking back a few times to make sure he didn't follow. I don't know what was up with that guy. Maybe he was just some harmless guy wanting to have a chat, but my gut told me to get away, so that's what I did. Another couple hours later, I made it to my camp for the night. The sun was already setting, so it was getting pretty dark, and although I was tired, something told me to wait to set up my tent or really unpack anything until later, just in case I had to make a quick exit. Thank God I did, because not 10 minutes later again, I heard those same footsteps crunching on the leaves down the trail. A moment later, the man showed up holding that creepy grin that he had before. It definitely wasn't smart of me, but immediately when I saw him, I got really mad. I felt like I'd done everything to get away from this guy, and now I was pissed. He said he was staying at the other camp, so what the hell was he doing here? Stupidly, I straight up asked if he was following me, and I made it clear by the tone of my voice that I was serious. But the guy just jokingly laughed and said, "Yeah, I'm following you," like he was being sarcastic. He still had that stupid, creepy smile across his face. He started asking if I was hungry after all that walking, but I quickly grabbed my bag and ignored him, walking back the way I came. Again, I didn't see him immediately follow me, but I knew better than to trust that. I passed the previous camp, exhausted, but continued until I couldn't anymore. I was maybe a mile past the first camp. I moved off the trail. Honestly, I'm not sure how far off I even went, probably 200 to 300 feet, then discreetly set up my tent. I left almost everything still in my backpack, just in case, then laid down and tried to sleep. Even with this really disturbing situation, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep surprisingly quickly. But in the middle of the night, my eyes shot open. I could hear footsteps crunching on the leaves right from where the trail was. It had to be him again, walking through the woods in the middle of the night, looking for me. The footsteps got closer, but then they started to fade out, moving further down the trail. He didn't see me. I waited until sunrise, then booked it back to my car. Thankfully, I never ran into him again. I don't know where he went after that. Honestly, I think I was disturbingly close to having something really horrifying happen. My encounter with that strange man could have been really bad, as I think he had some pretty nasty intentions, especially the more I think about the protein bar he tried to give me, and just the whole situation. It still makes me sick to think about.